Tonight, the advertised title of the talk is News to Nowhere, correct?
Correct.
Which is a little ambiguous. Who knows what that might mean? So let me explain to you where that title comes from. In 1973, there was a book published by a journalist, independent scholar type, called News from Nowhere. The News from Nowhere, a book about television. And in the early 1970s, people were starting to recognize that journalism, the news media, that means daily newspapers, it means, at that time, broadcast television, eventually expanded into cable television, a little bit of radio on the news, magazines that deal in news, the news media, journalism, which had always presented itself to the public as providing a neutral, fair, balanced, objective look at the world. News media made the argument they were simply kind of a mirror on society. And in the 1970s, people started to question that. Are news media really simply a mirror reflecting reality as it is? Or do the news media, do journalists, construct a particular view of reality? It was the beginning of a period in which we started to think a lot more about how any particular account of the world, whether it's journalistic or scholarly or political, is not a mere reflection of reality. It is a construction of reality. And people started to question journalism's claim, to use the most common phrase, to objectivity, to the ability to provide a neutral and objective account of the world that was beyond ideology. And The News from Nowhere was one of the books that kicked off that period of critique. And now, decades later, it's almost commonplace to understand that the news, journalism, is not a mere reflection of reality. It's a particular take on or construction of reality from a particular point of view. That the news isn't produced from nowhere, it's produced from a position. Journalists sit somewhere in the world and they look at the world with a perspective. Now, sometimes we focus on this perspective of that individual journalist. Right? What does that reporter or that editor think about the world? More importantly, I think we should be focusing on the institutions within which those journalists work. And what a lot of the research, my own experience, and I think common sense tells us is that what's important about the view that journalists have, once we realize they're not working from nowhere, they're not working from a position of neutrality, objectivity, that the view journalists take on the world, of course, is somewhat influenced by their own personal politics, religion, belief system. But it's more important to look at the institutions in which they work. So if I'm Bob Jensen reporting for the Austin American-Statesman, it might be interesting to know what I personally think about politics, religion, society. It's more interesting to know what the Austin American-Statesman thinks. And the Austin American-Statesman, of course, is not a person, it's a corporate entity. So one looks at the way the business is organized. One looks at the way that reporting is organized. And over time, we've come to a critique of how journalism operates. Not a critique in the sense that we just want to do nothing but trash journalism, but a critique in the sense of understanding better how journalism's particular account of the world operates. Let me give you an example. There's a lot of reporting these days on the use of drones by the US military, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan, correct? Right. Now, often that's reported as a part of the war on terror, yes? It's a component of the US war on terrorism. Terrorism is bad, yes? Right? Unless somebody wants to advocate for the routine use of terror in political life, no, okay, so terrorism is bad. A war on terror obviously makes sense. You want to try to eliminate something that's bad. And therefore, most of the reporting about the use of drones in this particular region of the world, framed by this war on terrorism, goes forward asking questions about, well, were these civilian casualties in this particular drone attack in Pakistan justified given the targeting? And you get that kind of conversation. Now, imagine a different way of presenting the drone story as a component of a long-standing US imperialist war on the people of the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia to extend and deepen American dominance in one of the most strategic regions of the world, based primarily on its production of energy. That's a very different way to understand drone warfare than the war on terror. From that point of view, the use of drones is not primarily about trying to identify and eliminate terrorist threats that might be targeting the US. It's part of a larger US military effort in that part of the world to dominate. If you're reporting from that point of view, from that perspective, you're going to highlight different facts, you're going to use different sources, and you're going to present a picture of the world quite differently than if you're using the framework of the war on terrorism. Well, which is the appropriate way to report the news? Well, we could have a debate about that, and people do debate it. But whatever we would conclude, it would be clear that our reporting of the facts of the day is very much influenced by the framework in which we understand those facts, correct? Okay, so far so good, that the news doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from a point of view. And that point of view is influenced by individual reporters and editors, but it's also influenced by the nature of the institutions within which they work. And it's also very much influenced by the general ideological framework of the culture. So the war on terrorism is very familiar. That's the dominant framework we use in this culture to understand this. But there is this alternative framework, much less common, but which demonstrates that the news does come from somewhere. All right. That's all by way of introduction and explanation of the title. So the title of this talk is not the news from nowhere, it's the news to nowhere. Yes? Different preposition. Okay, so if we could debate, and I'm happy to, in questions and comment, talk about the summary I just gave you of contemporary understandings of how news is produced. But I want to kind of fast forward and say that these questions about where the news is produced from are important. What are the nature of the journalists doing the work? What is the nature of the institutions? What's the ideological framework? All of that's important. I don't want to minimize that. But I want to highlight what I think is, in some ways, a more pressing question that's captured in this phrase, the news to nowhere. And that's a reflection of my own assessment of the current state of the world and where we're heading. In a nutshell, the current state of the world is bad. It's getting worse, and we're heading over the cliff. Okay, so that's it. You now have been warned this is not going to be a particularly upbeat talk. But we'll try and make sense of it. Okay, so what do I mean by that? The news is bad, the news is getting worse, and where we're heading is over the cliff. We've already highlighted the question of the role of the United States around the world. And that role is changing. I was born in 1955. I'm one of the older people in the room. Or excuse me, 1958. I'm 55 years old. Wait, when was I born? Yeah, born 58. Okay, got it. Okay. So, wait till you're this old. Yeah, all you young people laughing. Look at the old guy. Can't remember when he was born. That's not the worst of the problems. Let me tell you, my knees, the pains I got in the morning. Don't get me started on my prostate. I don't even want to go there. My God, it's terrible. Okay, so back on point. What was my point? Oh, yeah, okay, so I was born in 1958 at a point when the US domination of the world was unchallenged. Throughout most of my life, the ability of the United States to project power in both economic and military terms was essentially unchallenged. After the fall of the Soviet Union, for a brief period, there was virtually no state that could challenge US power around the world. But that's changing. So one of the things that is different in the equation that leads me to want to talk about the news to nowhere is the fact that the world that the United States thought it could control, it can no longer control. And that the use of the term empire to describe the United States is, I think, still accurate, but we are now an empire in decline. That our ability to project military and economic power around the world, which I think was always, should have been subject to a moral critique, is now clearly in decline. And not just a temporary lull, but in a, I think, a permanent decline. But you can't talk about that without talking about the reason the United States might have wanted to project power around the world, and that's rooted in economics, which requires that we speak about the economic system, contemporary corporate capitalism. And here again, I think that the problems we're experiencing now are not simply a cyclical downturn, but part of a permanent decline. I think that this system is not just going through a problem caused by the financial meltdown of 2008, but is in a period of serious decline. We can talk about that, but the real issue is not empire economics, but ecology. Okay? That if you look at all of the indicators of the health of the ecosphere, the planet Earth, the larger living world of which we are a part, right? Look at any indication of the basic health of the ecosphere, and that's where the news is really bad and really getting worse. And I don't care what measure you choose, right? Whatever you want to look at, whatever data you want to look at that's coming out of biology, ecology, any of the sciences that are looking at this, right? What you're going to find is some very bad news. Bad news about soil. Soil is pretty important stuff, yes? For those of you who are city kids, soil is where food comes from. Okay? So, in case you're not aware of this, food does not grow in the back of the HEB. It grows in the dirt. And we have ongoing problems, in some ways accelerating problems, about soil erosion because of contemporary farming methods. We have a crisis in soil erosion, soil being eroded, washing into rivers and streams, most of it ending up in the Mississippi and heading down to the Gulf of Mexico. We lose in the world about 23 billion tons of soil a year, topsoil, and topsoil erodes much faster than it is created. It's a problem. Okay. That soil, which washes into the Gulf of Mexico, has other problems. It creates what we call dead zones because much of that soil is nitrogen rich because of chemical fertilizers. And so now we have ever greater in size and number dead zones in the world's oceans where nothing basically lives. Right? That's a problem, yes. Groundwater contamination, right? The quickly dwindling supplies of fresh water in parts of the world. Aquifers that are being drawn down at rates well beyond replacement levels. Okay. Chemical contamination, both in our own bodies and in the ecosystems. The toxicity of the modern petrochemical-based world. Species extinction, the lack of biodiversity. We're losing species at an alarming rate. Right? In other words, we're taking out of a complex world which has been in balance for many, hundreds of thousands of millions of years. We're taking species out at a dramatic rate without any awareness of the long-term consequences of that. And then there is the big one, kind of the mother of all ecological crises, and that's, of course, climate change, climate disruption, global warming, call it what you want. I tend to use the word rapid climate destabilization. We know why it's happening. Greenhouse gases, we know the major source of them, the burning of fossil fuels, methane release, all sorts of things, but we know what's going on. So if you add all of that up, I think it's fair to say the news is bad and it's getting worse. There are some places where you can find local improvements in an ecosystem. You can go to some places and they'll have cleaned up a river, or some places where the air pollution is better than it was 20 years ago. That's largely a product of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which were passed in the 1970s. So, there was a famous case in Cleveland, somewhere in Ohio, where there was a river that was actually so polluted it used to catch fire. Well, that river has been cleaned up, and that's a good thing. But those are very localized improvements. If you again look at the systems, and look at the health of those systems, I think it's fair to say the news is bad, and it's getting worse. Now, I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a scientist, but I try to read a lot, and I have a lot of friends who are ecologists, and every time I meet a new person who's expert in this field, I say, I have a question. I said, here's how it looks to me as a layperson, reading the data, reading scientific publications to the degree I can. I said, to me it looks like, there's some trouble. And to a person, every scientist or ecologist I've ever talked to said, oh no, it's much worse than you can imagine. You're a very nice person, they'll say, Bob, but you're not smart enough to actually know what I know, they'll say. And what we know in the sciences is that, to some degree, I think you can almost say, it's kind of game over. Right? That at this point, the possibility of a large-scale human population continuing on the planet, living at something roughly like the level that we live today, realizing, of course, there's great disparities in how people live, but just on the aggregate level, 7 billion people consuming like we consume today is simply impossible, not only in some science fiction future, but within your lifetimes, the younger people in the room. Because I am a bit older, I may get lucky and die before all of this comes crashing down, but it, I think, is now pretty clear that we cannot maintain the world in which we live like this. Okay? Now, that's a general summary of a set of complex questions. But sort of trying to watch faces and body language, no one was doing this. Oh God, what an asshole, I can't. Right? There was nobody who was indicating to me through facial expression or body language that you think anything I said was crazy. You may not agree with some of the finer points, but I think this is the reaction of most ordinary people. That summary does describe to some degree the way a lot of us see the world now, yes? Does anybody here want to argue that we can continue extracting fossil fuels out of the earth by ever more extreme measures, like fracking and deep water drilling and mountaintop coal removal and mining the tar sands in Alberta? We can talk about any of those processes if you're not familiar with them. Does anybody think we can continue to go after the most dangerous and dirty fossil fuels on the planet and burn them at the rate we are burning them and escape consequences? Does anybody want to make that argument? No. No sane person would make that argument. If any of what I said is true to even any extent, it means there's a lot of reckoning that we have to do about the way we live in relationship to this larger living world. Right? Now, back to journalism. Journalism's claim in a democracy, in a democratic society like this, it's claim to special status. It's claim that you should pay attention, you should buy newspapers, you should turn on the television, you should sit through the advertisements, right? You should do all of this. Why? Because journalism will amuse you? Well, journalism sometimes does amuse us. I like to read the comics. Does journalism say you should do this because we'll deliver the sports scores to you? Well, journalism does deliver the sports scores. But journalism's claim to having special status, to being an important part of a democratic system, is not in the way it can amuse or titillate us. Journalism's claim to special status is that it provides a critical and independent source of information to people who are citizens in a democratic society, so citizens can, to the degree they choose to, participate in self-governance. That's what journalism says. Take us seriously, give us some of your money, and treat us with respect because we do this for you. Now, the key terms there are critical and independent. Journalism claims to be a source of critical and independent information. Right? Well, that's important. The independent part especially is important because This is a society awash in information, yes? If you want information, there's no shortage of places to go get it. Corporations provide you a lot of information, yes? The government provides you with a lot of information, yes? Right? Do you trust everything corporation and government tells you? No, you'd be crazy to, because that information comes with self-interest attached. Corporations do not seek the truth and report it to the fullest extent of their ability. Corporations provide you information that will help them achieve their goal, and their goal is very simple: to maximize market share and profit. That's the only reason a corporation exists. By law and tradition, a corporation exists to maximize the return to shareholders. It doesn't exist to make you a smarter person. Okay. Government. Well, government is supposed to serve the people. That's the whole idea in democracy. We are sovereign, the government is our servant. But history is pretty clear on this. Roy, you're a specialist in this. Do governments always provide the fullest and most complete information about their own activities to citizens? Good, no. See, I appreciate that input there, Roy. I mean, most of us stop believing that roughly about the same time we give up belief in Santa Claus. Okay. So journalism says, listen, there's all this information coming from corporations and government, but you need us because we are independent. We are independent of any of these centers of power. And they also say we provide a critical information. We provide the tough kinds of reporting that are needed for people to see the truth. Okay. So if in fact this account of the world I just summarized, the decline of the role of the United States as an empire around the world, the decline of an economy, both complex questions that can be debated in lots of ways, but certainly trends that are hard to miss. And the more fundamental and the more threatening series of ecological crises, plural, not just one crisis, but a series of crises that everyone at some level recognizes are a tremendous threat. If journalism was providing a critical and independent source of the information we need so that we can participate to the degree we choose to in self-governance, then the account of the world I just offered would certainly be front and center in American journalism, yes? Just take climate change alone. If we took climate change seriously within journalism, it would be a front page story, not every few months when a report comes out, but it would be a front page story every day. It's hard to imagine how a process, climate change, that could threaten the ability of us to continue to live isn't a front page story every day. I mean, is there something more important than that? Other than the Longhorn football game? We're going up against Oklahoma State. I think it'll be a tough weekend. I'm really nervous already. Of course, that's front page news. That and, I heard on the radio just coming over here that Lady Gaga is going to marry Tom Cruise. And that, of course, I need up-to-the-date information. Somebody get online. I made that up.
I was like,
Some of you are going, really? I didn't hear that. I didn't even know they were dating. Gotcha. Okay, so what's going on? We got a problem. When the institution, the free press, journalism, the news media, claims to be the source of a critical and independent account of the world, including an account of those aspects of the world that challenge concentrated power, seems unable to do that. So the question is why? And then that goes back to this news from nowhere, the complex way in which the interplay between the individual journalists, the institutions in which they work, and the larger ideological framework of the culture, right, affects the production of news. But that's where this title comes from, the news to nowhere. My fear that, in fact, because the dominant institutions of the culture, primarily the government and the corporation, and the way in which they are very intimately intertwined in today's world, they have an interest in avoiding that reality. So the question is, how are we going to face that reality? I happen to be a former journalist and I teach in a journalism school, so I think a lot about the news media's role and the news media's failure in this. But it is not the failure of the news media alone. You could also say it's a failure of the churches, it's a failure of the schools, it's a failure of the universities. Right? But whatever our primary interest is in the world, whichever institutions we tend to live in, study, whatever, it seems to me that this is the question. Are we in fact on a road to nowhere? And if so, what are we going to do to intervene in it? So, my preference was to speak fairly briefly, and I did a pretty good job, kept it under a half an hour. I'm proud of myself. You know professors, they don't know how to be brief. So I feel, pardon? No comment, okay. But those are some of the issues I wanted to put out in front of us, and then open it up to comments, questions, criticisms, challenges, verbal abuse, whatever it is that you're comfortable with is fine with me. So the floor is open for your participation.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
So are you saying that journalism could never really be truly objective, or
Okay.
in your opinion?
Yeah. There's been a lot of debate over this question of objectivity. So let me throw out three terms that I think help us. One of which is objectivity, but I don't want to start there. Journalism claims, and journalists claim, to be neutral in their work. Right? Neutral in the sense that there are debates going on in the culture, and journalists want to step out of those and be neutral in the way they report on the world, and then neutral in the way they present the results of their reporting to the public. The first question is there such a thing as neutrality? Is neutrality in this context even a coherent concept? And the argument I would make, which is not unique or original to me, is that no, there is no neutral place from which to stand and either observe the world or present the results of your observations to others. That neutrality is in fact a kind of illusion. Now, that's in some sense that's a philosophical discussion, but I think the way that the human mind works makes this self-evident, that nobody gets up in the morning and is truly a blank slate, yes? I mean, think of what that would really mean. If you got up every morning and said, well, I'm not going to accept any prior conclusions about anything. I mean, you'd be paralyzed. It's like, well, I don't know, if I take a step, will I fall through the earth into into the core and melt, No, so, from the most trivial to actually quite important, we make assumptions about how the world works. In other words, everything we do is based on some, you could call it a theory about how the world works. Therefore, a lot of what structures the way we think and go about our business in the world is essentially a process and a result of a lot of unquestioned assumptions. Right? But those assumptions do point us in one direction or another, and so neutrality, just by virtue of the way you think for 5 seconds about how we operate in the world, doesn't make a lot of sense. Neutrality in presentation doesn't make a lot of sense because if you look at the way language works, human beings communicate through language, and there is no such thing as a neutral term. You can't find language that is truly neutral. The example I use in class, and we have a lot of fun with this, so I'll give you a very condensed version, is I ask students to fill in the blank in a simple sentence. Columbus blanked America. So when I was a child, growing up in school, we filled in that blank a certain way. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Remember the old folk we all remember? And Columbus discovered America, yes? Okay, there's a problem, it's obvious, the problem with the use of the word discovered. Discovery implies that one is the first human being to either find a particular material object in the world or discover an idea, right? Discovery implies being the first, yes? There were human beings on the island of Hispaniola where Columbus landed. Therefore, to claim that Columbus discovered America is to claim there were no human beings living there, which is to claim that the human beings living there weren't fully human. And that's what we typically call racism. And whatever it is, it's not neutral. Right? So people say, okay, well, what would be an alternative? Let's find a neutral term. And sometimes people will say, well, Columbus exploited, conquered, destroyed, right? Well, those might be, from the point of view of some of us, more accurate terms, but there's an underlying politics and moral evaluation to those words as well. And so sometimes people say, I'll draw this out a bit, it's kind of a fun example. Usually somebody in the class will say, well, how about Columbus encountered America? Or Columbus, my favorite one, stumbled upon America. You know, it's like, oops, there's America. That appears to be more neutral, yes? It seems like a neutral term, encountered. Hi, we encountered each other. It doesn't appear to have an underlying political or moral agenda. So to evaluate that, let's imagine an analogy. Imagine you live on a nice, quiet residential street. I live in a cul-de-sac, so you know, there's 6 houses in our cul-de-sac. And you know, one night you're going about your business, you're planting your garden, your neighbor's mowing the lawn, children are out playing, frolicking, dogs or cats, nice little neighborhood. And in roll about 25 hardcore bikers, right? Real Hells Angels types, you know? And they roll up to your house first, and they kick down the door, and they come in with shotguns, they kill everybody, they take everything. You manage to somehow, you know, survive, and you're in the garden, remember, so you're hiding under the dirt, hoping they don't come and kill you. And they go from house to house, the bikers, and raping, pillaging, destroying, stealing, and then burning the whole neighborhood, okay? You're the only one left. And you look up. How would you react if someone said, well, these bikers encountered the neighborhood? That would seem, it's neutral in a sense, but you know, it hides the violence that was just done. So by trying to find a neutral term, you actually are importing a whole lot of politics there too. My point is simple. There is no neutral way to describe the world. There is no neutral place from which to observe the world. If that's true, neutrality is an illusion. Now, neutrality can sometimes, you can appear to be neutral, but typically only if you are in line with the dominant culture's conventional wisdom. So I'll give you another example of this. I don't know if you know, but the University of Texas at Austin tends to get very excited about its football team. Yes? Longhorns, a lot of excitement. So I do this example in class too. As we're getting ready to leave for the weekend, I say to students, now remember, there's a home football game this weekend. And football is a corrosive element in any university. We pay our football coach, I don't know if you know this, we pay our football coach, his name is Mac Brown. We pay him $5.4 million a year to coach a children's game, all right? The corruption of the athletic department in terms of how its student athletes are treated, the routine, you know, abuse of, you know, a sort of academic system, it's just disgusting, right? Football is an incredibly corrosive element in contemporary higher education. And anybody with any self-respect would boycott the football game. So I stand up and I say to my students, if you care at all about your education, if you have a shred of self-respect, if you want to be decent human beings, you will boycott this football game. Because football is an abomination on this campus. In fact, if you had any self-respect, you would probably hunt down Mac Brown and hang him from a lamppost. Because by God, what man has a right to make five, you know, this is, you know, okay. You get the point. Now, then I stop. And I say to the students, I say, obviously I was joking, but if I had made a speech like that, you might have thought I was injecting my own politics into the classroom, yes? That would be an appropriate response. That Jensen is taking his own political position and pushing it on people, and that's inappropriate. Okay. Now, imagine another scenario. It's the weekend and I'm wrapping up class, or we're getting ready for the weekend, and I say, hey everybody, remember there's a home game this weekend, so go out and show some school spirit. See you on Monday. Now, if I said that, There might be people who don't like football who grumble and say, oh, fuck, I'm so sick of football, whatever. But is it likely that students in mass are going to say, did you notice Jensen injecting his political opinion in the classroom, trying to give us this subtle message that football's good? Nobody would say that. Even people who don't like football probably wouldn't say it. Why? Because the dominant culture at UT produces a conventional wisdom that is pro-football. That was funny. I didn't even try that. That was a joke. Yeah, that was pro, meaning in favor of football, but the joke that college football is really just a form of pro-football. That was funny. You should laugh. You especially, this folded arm. I'm not laughing at your stupid joke. Okay. All right, it was, I'm just kidding. But that was pretty good. It was unintentional. The very short pro in favor of football comment has a politics to it, yes? The anti-football tirade has a politics to it. But only one is visible as a political rant. Because if you go with the dominant culture, if you're with the current, your politics seem invisible. It's only when you object to the dominant culture and its conventional wisdom that those claims seem political, but they're all political. It was a very long answer to a very short question. Neutrality is impossible. Journalists also like to claim that they're outside of ideology, that they report from a position that has no ideology. And the one thing you can always count on is anybody who says, I don't have an ideology, is likely the most ideological person in the room. Because we all have an ideology in the sense we all have a framework within which we process and understand the world. And people who think they somehow don't have an ideology are usually, again, just captured by the dominant culture's ideology. So objectivity, if by that we mean an ability to report from a neutral position outside of ideology, is simply incoherent. And there's a much longer critique of the actual news practices, the actual way in which journalists do their job that indicates, I think, even more that this notion of objectivity is an illusion. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, to the degree possible, to step outside of our own preconceived notions of the world. That's a good thing to do, yes? Everybody has preconceived notions about the world, and we should all be trying to step outside of them and test our own assumptions. But everybody should be doing that. Every decent human being should be capable of engaging in that kind of critical self-reflection. Journalists should do it, professors should do it, students should do it, everybody should do it. Journalists have no special sort of magic that allows them to do it in some way that leads to the claim that they transcend all of these realities about politics, moral claims, frameworks, ideology, all that kind of stuff. I promise that the next question or comment I will not take as long to respond to, but I happen to like those two examples. Yes, ma'am.
So the problems that you've outlined, the challenges of global warming and the challenges to the ecology, suggest that we need to do long-term planning and to be able to cooperate in order to come up with policies to address these kinds of issues. I'm concerned that the atomization of the present is eliminating our ability to even see the future. And I see this in journalism in that when I was younger, I would get the New York Times and read the New York Times and be, perfectly prepared to wait until tomorrow to read tomorrow's New York Times. Today, I don't even bother half of the time with the New York Times posting on the internet because they don't they don't update their headlines and their articles quickly enough. And I'm checking several times a day, and I'm so distracted by the proliferation of the present that I can't even see the future, and I see that as a kind of trend. So how does journalism deal with that, and how do we deal with these big problems given that kind of trend?
Oh, I'm sorry, did you say something? I just checked my email.
I was getting back at you.
Yeah, that's a problem. So, it's good to put it in context. Human beings, the species we are, you got to remember we evolved in a very different world than the one we live in. Right? when human beings were hunter-gatherers, living in small band-level societies, probably no more than about 100, we didn't think a lot about the long-term future. We didn't have to. We thought about a short-term future, and we planned within a context of a stable world in which our knowledge was limited, but our knowledge was adequate to operate within that. Right? So we didn't evolve to be, always thinking about potential threats 150 years from now. So we should go easy on ourselves. Right? In a way, we're kind of operating the way we're designed to operate. The problem is that style of operation is now truly lethal. So our you could call it a sort of bias for the present, is now being exacerbated by technologies that give us a bias for the minute by minute, second by second. And so we aren't cultivating habits of reflection and long-term vision. I think that's true. Okay. Journalism, to the degree it buys into and magnifies and amplifies that, is going to be part of the problem. But that's not just journalism. I mean, that's to some degree the whole culture. Originally, I thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction, so I'm going to go in the direction I thought you were going that you didn't, which is, I think, also relevant and maybe even connected in ways I haven't thought through yet. Which is that you said cooperation, and that's what keyed me. When one recognizes that there is no solution to problems like global warming without cooperation, and literally global cooperation, because if half the population of the world takes global warming seriously and the other half doesn't, everybody loses. Well, when you say that, people often say, well, people aren't cooperative. After all, what are people? They're greedy and self-interested, yes? That's obvious. Look around. How do people behave? Well, greedy, self-interested. Well, to some degree that's true, of course. People do act routinely in contemporary culture in a greedy and self-interested way. But is that natural? Is that the natural state of human affairs? Well, the answer is actually pretty complicated, because it probably is not natural. If by natural we mean it's the way we evolved, going back to this evolutionary history. In hunting and gathering bands of 100 people, which again is about 95% of our evolutionary history, competition as we understand it really didn't exist. It wasn't because people were saints. It was because when you live in that context, competition makes no sense. Your survival is tied to the survival of the others in your society, it's a fairly small society. So if anything, we are probably naturally evolved to be cooperative beings. If that's true, why are people so nasty? Well, think about the system you live in. Contemporary corporate capitalism. Does it reward being nice? No. The rewards in the system are toward competition, aggression, domination, subordination of the needs, even sometimes the humanity of other people. So if you have a system that rewards greed and self-interest, and in fact to some degree rewards what we could call sociopathic behavior, behavior that kind of is counter to our own moral principles, well then that's the way people are going to respond. So in addition to trying to get a handle on all of these problems and figure out solutions, we also, I think, inevitably are led to the realization that there really are no solutions to these problems within the existing system. We not only have to deal with the problems, we have to deal with them in entirely new ways of organizing ourselves economically, how we produce, distribute, and consume goods, which human beings will always be doing. But the way we organize that today is exacerbating the problems and, I think, impeding our ability to both see the problems clearly and act on them intelligently. So there's a lot of work to do, and that work is usually more difficult than we first recognize. And that's part of this whole discussion as well. And that takes long-term planning, it takes complex thinking, it takes all the things that contemporary life undermines, essentially. So it's a big problem. Yes?
Who's leading us down this road? Is it us leading the media, or you said it's the media leading us, or is it the the alliances between government and the media and business? Whose fault is it?
The answer is yes, 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 and yes. So, you know, when one tries to ask who's at fault, like, who's the bad guy in all of this? Bad guys, bad people. Usually the answer is complicated. So to get into that, I'm going to cite one of my favorite theologians. I like to read theology. Lots of interesting ideas in it. And there was a guy named Rabbi Joshua Abraham Heschel, who was not only a Jewish theologian, but also a very important civil rights activist. He was a prominent public figure in the 1960s, marched with King, the whole story. Anyway, Heschel wrote an interesting book called The Prophets, and this digression into Old Testament Hebrew Bible theology will make sense in a minute, just hang in there. And he looked at the prophets, the prophetic texts of the Hebrew Bible, of what Christians call the Old Testament. Right? Jeremiah and Micah and Amos and all these. And he came to some, I thought, very interesting conclusions. He pointed out that the prophets were not only criticizing and calling to account the leaders of ancient Israel, which is part of what they did. You know, if you read those prophetic texts, people like Jeremiah saying, all right, you the king, you're messing up. You're breaking the covenant with God. You know, you're letting people fall into poverty. You're enriching yourself. There was all of that kind of prophetic critique of power in those texts. But there was also, Heschel pointed out, a challenge to ordinary people who were allowing these things to happen. And the way he summed it up, a very pithy phrase, it's often quoted, is that he said, few are guilty, but all are responsible. That's a powerful statement. Few are guilty. You want to look at any particular problem in the United States or anywhere else. Right? Take the one that's easiest, the US invasion of Iraq. Right? I happen to think that was a criminal act. It certainly didn't work out very well for anybody, for the people of Iraq. Certainly didn't work out very well for US service personnel, and in fact helped destabilize an entire region, maybe never to recover. All right, who's guilty? Well, you can point to them. You know, you start with the decision makers, George Bush, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Donald Rumsfeld, all the way down to the high-level military generals who planned and executed it. Okay, they're the ones that you would say are guilty. You hold them accountable in some legal sense. But is there a way in which all are responsible? That doesn't mean every single person bears the same responsibility. Right? An ACC student struggling to work 2 jobs and get a degree is not responsible in the same way the CEO of the Raytheon Corporation is. Right? But it's a reminder that we do all have a role in this. So when you ask what's taking us on this path to nowhere, well, certainly people in power, governmental power, corporate power, and the way they, as you point out, are intertwined. They have short-term material self-interest to continue in this behavior. And we might want to point to them and say, you know, the board of directors of, you know, ExxonMobil bear a certain amount of guilt because they are pursuing a business strategy that, if it is in fact executed, will guarantee the large-scale destruction of most of humanity. And if we burn all of the oil that ExxonMobil has on its books, in its reserves, and that it is basing its profit and loss statements on, if they burn all that, it really is the end of the world, as we know it. Right? But we're all part of a world in which we consume energy, and so I think, you know, that's the way I would look at it. And that reminds us that we need to critique concentrations of power. I think that's part of being a moral person and a citizen and all of that. But there's a way we also have to think through how we all, and I don't just mean the wealthy, I don't just mean the Donald Trumps of the world, but all of us who live at some level of material comfort, meaning we eat regularly, we sleep in a bed every night, you know, that kind of thing. We're all part of it too. And that's troubling. It's not clear what the, you know, the path forward is sometimes. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
When did people realize this was a major concern?
The global warming part of it, or?
Yeah, like the fossil fuels,
Yeah.
like everything involving.
Well, that's interesting. So the question is, when did people start to wake up to the scale and scope of the crises?
Yes.
Well, you can go back, you can go back into the Roman Empire. And Rome was an imperial power that concentrated wealth. And one of the ways it did that was to enrich itself, constantly acquired new territory. And farming practices there were very different. It was before petroleum. But they were particularly destructive. And Rome would wear out the soils and the fertility of an area and then move on. And there were people, even back then, who could see that this process of imperial expansion and the wasting of nature was going to lead to no good. Right? In virtually every era, there have been voices calling out that. Back to, as we were saying, the standard texts of, the Hebrew Bible. Those prophets were engaged in some form of this. Right? The modern awareness of the effect of the petrochemical revolution, right? The drilling of all that fossil fuel and the creation of new synthetic chemicals and everything, that's usually charted in the 1960s. There was a book published called Silent Spring by a woman named Rachel Carson, who started to wake us up to the long-term health effects, both health of the human body and health of the ecosystems, of some of these synthetic petro-based chemicals. Right? Now, if that sort of just sounds like gobbledygook, just remember that the first oil well in the United States, first commercial oil well, was sunk in 1859. It's fairly recent. All of these things that we live with, like this plastic, that's really fairly recent. Right? And it wasn't really until after World War II that the large-scale production of petrochemicals became normalized. And that means in a matter of decades, we started producing things that our bodies had no evolutionary history with. Right? Putting into the world chemicals, and we didn't know what they did to us because they were brand new. Right? And it was in the 60s that people started to see the evidence starting to mount of what the long-term effects of that were going to be. And that's often what we chart as the birth of the modern environmental movement. The first book for a general audience, a public audience, about global warming was published in 1989. It was called The End of Nature. It was written by a young writer named Bill McKibben. Bill is now a slightly older writer, still one of the most, I think, clear voices on this subject in public, and a leading campaigner to try to reduce human use of fossil fuels. So we've known about the scientific community was starting to form a consensus about global warming by the early 1980s. By the late 1980s, Bill McKibben could write a book that laid out the case pretty clearly. And over the decades, the evidence has simply mounted to the point where there is no significant scientific debate anymore about this. There are scientific questions about how it's going forward, how to use models to predict and all that sort of thing. But the fact that the planet is warming and that the primary driver of that warming is human activity is no longer even up for grabs. So this is a fairly short amount of time that we've had to grapple with these kind of things. Some of the other things that I mentioned, like species extinction, right? That's dramatically increased in recent years, and biologists have become more aware of why it's a threat. And it's a complex story. But certainly, over the last, I would say 2 to 3 decades, there has been no one who could claim if they were aware. No one who's my age can claim not to know about this. It is that, in some sense, easily accessible, I think. Yeah.
Would you say that journalism's kind of shift from an entity that used to provide information to the public to one where it's all about sensationalism and entertainment, whose main concern is what next 2 celebrities may be going out or whatever? Would you say that this shift is kind of due to either government's just general corruption or our development of society, or is it just humanity's tendency to just ignore anything that doesn't immediately affect them?
So the question is about these changes in journalism that make it harder to bring up serious subjects, and journalism sort of gravitating toward sensational, celebrity-driven news and that. First of all, it's actually a more complicated story because journalism in the United States, at least, has gone through a number of different cycles. And the kind of sensationalism that you're talking about is not unique to this particular period. There was a phrase at the end of the 19th and early 20th century called yellow journalism. It's a long story about why it was called yellow. But it was basically a critique of the sensationalism and celebrity-driven news of that day. So journalism, like other institutions, goes through cycles. And things get out of control and get roped back in and that sort of thing. Also, throughout US history, the funding mechanism for journalism has changed, and that's had a big effect. It's a long story. But the point of that is to remember that there is rarely a golden age to look back to when everything worked well. And we have that tendency, especially the older we get, to want to say, well, back when I was young, everything worked fine. So for instance, you hear this a lot in contemporary politics, especially from the Tea Party movement. We need to get back to that period when American politics worked. Right? Well, when was that period? Well, for a lot of people, that period was the 1950s. The 1950s, interesting period. In the 1950s, a number of you who are in the room right now couldn't vote. Well, that's an optimal political, where a significant portion of the adult population is disenfranchised because of white supremacy. In the 1950s, anybody with political views on the left, people like me, my political views put me down in 1950, I wouldn't be teaching at the University of Texas. I would have been fired. It might be that the FBI was on my tail. The anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s, which we typically use this sort of blanket phrase, McCarthyism, to describe, meant that critical points of view about the US role in the world and the US economy were essentially outlawed. It wasn't until 1957 that the US, I'm digressing a bit here, but it's relevant. It wasn't until 1957 that the US Supreme Court finally said that you couldn't criminalize membership in the Communist Party. Now, whatever you think of the Communist Party, up until 1957, just belonging to a political party was the grounds for federal prosecution and imprisonment. Does it sound like a very democratic society when you can be put in prison just for having a set of beliefs? Well, that doesn't sound very democratic. So when was this golden age when everything worked well here? That's the thing we have to, I think, avoid. So there are some particular problems in American journalism. Some of them mirror problems of past eras. Some of them, especially the way in which technology can exacerbate them, I think are relatively new. But the main problem is that journalism, holding itself out as a critical and independent voice, is often, because of much of what we've been talking about, is unable to provide that. And it's, I think, the case that the consequences are more important. The stakes are higher today. Right? If, in fact, the American public cannot come together, identify threats, agree on the nature of those threats, and start to think systematically about not only how to devise short-term policies to deal with them, but how to start to think about restructuring our whole society. If we can't do that, then we're in trouble. So journalism's failure today, in some ways, is no worse than journalism's failure in other eras. Just like you could say the way that universities fail sometimes to provide the space for this kind of critical work as well. That universities are failing today in certain ways. We could go on another whole rant about the University of Texas and how it fails to be that critical independent space that I think is needed and universities are supposed to be. That's not unique to this moment in history, but again, the stakes are higher. And that's what I think is really different. Institutions, especially large institutions, always have problems. Because it's hard to put, we have 50,000 students at the University of Texas. ACC as a system has tens of thousands of students. How do you make systems with that many people in them work? It's hard, So the institutions always have problems, but the problems, I think, are much more dramatic today given these trends that we're talking about. Yes?
Do you think it's too late to try and save the world?
Do I think it's too late to try and save the world? That's actually, that's a very good, in fact, that may be the most important question we should all be thinking about. And I think if the question implies, and I don't think you're implying it. But if the question implies, is it too late to save the world as we know it? The answer is yes, and it's been yes for a long, long time. That is, if you want to save a world in which everybody's aspiration is to have a big car and at least 3 plasma screen TVs in your house so that you can play your at least 3 different game consoles, and the ability to fly around the country or around the world at a relatively low cost anytime you want to, and take ocean cruises and all, yeah, if you ask, is it too late to save that world? Yes. And in some ways, I'm glad we're not capable of saving, because I'm not sure that's a particularly good world, right? Especially when the ability of some people to engage in that level of consumption is premised on keeping about half the world's population in abject poverty, because that's the other part of this we haven't spent a lot of time talking about. Remember that all of the material consumption in the first world that's routine for us is only possible because in other parts of the world, people are kept in a state of permanent poverty. Okay. If you mean, is it too late to save the world if we can revision the world along more humane lines, where our expectations about material consumption, especially the consumption of energy, are dramatically lower, and we, in a sense, recalibrate what it means to live a good life. One of the age-old philosophical questions is, what does it mean to live a good life? Right. Contemporary consumer capitalism defines that by maximizing the amount of crap you can stuff into your house. Right. That's essentially, if you just pay attention to commercial advertising, the way it answers the question, what does it mean to live a good life, is to consume. Right. Right. So if we recalibrate and redefine what it means to live a good life, and we recognize that it's unlikely the planet will be able to sustain a human population of 7-8 billion, and start to think seriously about that problem, sure, then it's not too late. If I were a betting person, I'm not sure how much money I would put on the likelihood that we will do that in an intelligent way in an adequate time frame. You know, I mean, it's hard to look around and be upbeat about that, yes? I mean, do you see processes or forces that seem to want to turn the tide quickly? I mean, you know, I don't see them. In fact, I see, a deeper sense of denial. Right? One of the way you deal with difficult problems tends to be either acknowledge, embrace, and confront them, or deny them. Those are kind of the 2 ways people deal with problems. And you look across this culture and there's a whole lot of denial going on. Up to and including a denial of basic science around things like global warming by people, I think, who simply don't want to confront what it means. Then you have people who accept global warming but deny the need for dramatic action. So there's a whole lot of denial going on. And I think that's the first thing, is to sort of be able to confront that deep, deep denial that, I mean, we're all capable of.
How would you define the dramatic action?
Dramatic action? Well, here's something that seems to make sense to me. To commit within a year to reduce the consumption of energy in the United States by 50%.
50?
50%, cut it in half. Okay, that's not actually adequate to solve the problems, but it's a nice start. Now that would mean a lot of things. And it's actually kind of hard to imagine being able to just feasibly do that, given the infrastructure of the contemporary world. But that would be, at least if I were president of the United States, and by the way, I'll be announcing my campaign shortly. That's what I would stand up and say. I'd say, okay, here's the way it is, people. This is a goal. Right? And that means a lot less of everything. It means nobody gets to have $54 billion in wealth, like Bill Gates. It means a lot of things that are politically hard to imagine. But that's where we have to, you know, you might say, well, and I'm sure some of you will, I'll save you the trouble of thinking it up for yourself. Just say as you're leaving, God, what a lunatic. You know, the shit they get away with at UT, geez, that guy teaches at UT, can you believe that? He's a lunatic. What are they hiring faculty directly from insane asylums now? What's going on at UT? They're paying the football coach so much that they gotta hire guys off the street. Like maybe I just started teaching today, and they were, I was at the intersection with a sign, and the president of UT had a pickup, and he was driving around. He said, "Hey, you want a job? Come on, I got to teach you some journalism." I mean, that's that's the way to ignore all of this. Right? But I don't think that'll get us very far. Yeah.
How do you think the best way to approach change is? I mean, do you think incentives for companies or policy to force compliance, or maybe incentives for families to do it on an individual basis?
My basic assumption is that problems created by market economies within capitalism will not be solved by market economies within capitalism. So let's take the problem of carbon, right? Greenhouse gases, the burning of fossil fuel. We have to reduce the amount of carbon we put in the atmosphere. If we don't, we're going to destroy ourselves. Okay. Now, there are generally three ways that people propose. One is what's called cap and trade, a complex market system where there's a maximal amount of carbon that can be emitted, and everybody gets credits. And if I want to sell my credits to Roy because he's got a more polluting industry than me, then we buy. It's a market-based system, and it's basically a shell game. It won't work. Most of the people who study these things kind of understand that. A second, more forceful response is a carbon tax, that you tax carbon and tax it at a rate that's going to reduce the amount that's put into the atmosphere. So if what's a gallon of gas these days? 3 something in Austin? How much?
It was 2 something.
Yeah, it's down below $3.
Okay, let's say $3 because I don't do complex math. I don't deal well with fractions. So $3. If there were a carbon tax that immediately doubled the price of gas, that'd be $6, by the way, for those of you who can't keep up. But 3 times 2, 6. Yeah, $6. How many of you would drive as much? Well, so if you put a tax on carbon, you're going to reduce the amount of carbon put in the atmosphere. But there's a problem with that that I see, which is if you tax gasoline so that it's $6 a gallon instead of $3, who gets that extra $3? The government, which is us collectively. What's the government going to do with that extra $3?
Subsidize gas prices.
It's probably going to go burn carbon somewhere, right? That money tends to find carbon to burn. And so I think cap and trade is just a joke. I think carbon taxes are limited. I think what we have to do is put a cap on carbon. We have to collectively determine that an absolute limit on how much carbon we burn as a society. That's called rationing. How much support for rationing in the United States is there? Zero. There was a little bit of support at times of crisis, like in World War II. Right? Well, the carbon crisis dwarfs the crisis of World War II, but we are not at a place where we would accept a cap on carbon. And the only way you can enforce rationing is through government enforcement, yes? Rationing implies collective acceptance of laws that set those limits. I think that's inevitably what it's going to take. But we're nowhere near the place where the Congress couldn't even pass a cap and trade system. Carbon taxes are way beyond our reach politically right now. And talking about rationing is, it's like talking about an income tax in Texas.
So then, do you think that it could never work with capitalism in general?
I do believe
to a different.
I do believe that we have to transcend both the moral claims of capitalism, the assertions about human nature that are in capitalism, and the system itself. I do not think there are solutions to the fundamental problems of this world within a capitalist economic system. Now, all of this obviously is not going to sell politically in the next election. Right? So what's the point? You might say, well, you can go back to any point in U.S. history, any point in world history, and see ideas that we're not going to sell in the next election, yes? The abolition of slavery was not going to sell in the election of 1800. In fact, it didn't. Right? Within, about a half a century, all of a sudden that was a proposal that was on the table in a meaningful way. took a war to achieve it. But so the inability to imagine a political proposal being accepted in the moment is not an argument against defending the proposal. In fact, I think it's an argument for making the proposal even more forceful. That we all should be talking about this. I saw another hand
What
somewhere.
if you what if by capping things, you slow production?
Yes.
By slowing production, you slow creativity, whereas the rest of the world is going to continue to feed themselves in any way possible, become creative, and find the next cure, like not this decade, but in decades ahead of us. Maybe we
Okay.
could find an optimistic invention, you know?
So this is an interesting and important question. First of all, and again, I'm not putting this on you, but one response to this analysis is don't worry about it, we'll invent our way out. Yes? That's what some of us call technological fundamentalism. What is fundamentalism? You know, whether it's religious or whatever. Fundamentalism is a kind of absolute certainty in one approach to the world. Fundamentalists are certain they are correct. And there's a kind of technological fundamentalism in this country and in the world more generally that says, yeah, we got a lot of problems, but we'll just invent our way out of them, because after all, we invented our way out of past problems. And that's a very reassuring approach, but I think in the end, it is a dead end. Because one of the things that we know from experience is that every time we fix problems with high energy, high technology, we tend to create problems we did not predict. You know, some people call this the law of unintended consequences. So let me give you an example. Some of us are old enough to remember the ozone hole. Right? If you're young, this is ancient history almost. So there are chemicals called CFCs. That stands for
Chlorofluorocarbons.
Thank you, because I can't say that without sounding drunk. Chlorofluorocarbon. Like, I always sound like I'm slurring. Like I stopped in. I got one of those really big beer cans at 7-Eleven before I came here. Chlorofluorocarbons. One more time.
Chlorofluorocarbons?
There, I'm impressed. That is. Are you a chemistry major?
No.
No, you're just smarter than I am, which is not hard to believe. CFCs. When CFCs were invented post-World War II, they were considered to be a miracle chemical. They had no known environmental problems. They were not reactive. And so they were used in things like air conditioning and propellants. If CFCs were this really cool thing. Right? Now, the problem was the CFCs don't cause problems on the surface of the Earth. But when they drift up in the upper atmosphere, what happens is they burn a hole in the ozone layer. And the ozone layer is this thing that keeps some very harmful radiation from hitting us. So you destroy the ozone layer in the upper atmosphere, and we all fry, right? We die. And so people said, wow, looks like these CFCs are a problem. We better do something. And they did do something. It was called the Montreal Protocol. And internationally, there was a gradual ban put in place on CFCs. You can still find them in the black market and things, but in the United States, they're pretty much gone. Right? And the ozone hole started to close. That was all good. Yes, that's a good thing. Now, what did we do? Did we say, these CFCs have been central to air conditioning, and we have a lot of air conditioning in this world, and we now have an experience of the way we did air conditioning being an environmental threat. So there are two things you can do at that point to say, let's back off from this commitment to air conditioning. Let's stop building buildings that have to be air conditioned to be in, like, I don't know. Can you open the window, Roy?
No.
Oh, you can't open the window. That means that you can't be in this building without air conditioning for about 8 months of the year. Right? Maybe the culture could have said, we've invested too much in this comfort. And air conditioning, especially in Texas, is very comfortable. I'm a big fan of it in that sense. But that's not what we did. We didn't say, let's recalibrate what it means to live a good life. What we did is find replacements for CFCs. And they started using something called HCFCs,
Chlorofluorocarbons.
Thank you very much. And they do not have the same effect in the upper atmosphere, and they do not burn away the ozone layer. Good, yes? There's only one problem that we've stumbled upon now, that HCFCs turn out to be a greenhouse gas and are contributing to global warming. So what do we do now? Do we say, let's have that conversation about backing away from a cultural commitment to air conditioning? No, we just scramble about looking for the next technological fix so that we can keep living the way we live. But what's likely to happen with the next technological fix? If history, is worth paying attention to, it's highly likely that that will cause unintended consequences. So we're on this kind of, it's like we're addicts, right? And all we can think about is the next fix to allow us to continue to experience the world as we experience it. And here's another part of this. All of this creativity, and let's face it, science and technology has unleashed incredible creativity. I mean, this is, the fact that most of the world that we live in didn't exist 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that's pretty amazing, yes? Human beings invented a lot of really cool stuff. Yeah? No, you ever seen an Xbox? It's pretty cool. Okay, so, but what made all of that creativity possible? Coal, oil, natural gas. All this energy that was suddenly available to us that made it possible for people to sit around in laboratories and tinker. Take away coal, oil, and natural gas, and how creative are we likely to be? So it's a question of, in a sense, investment. Do we invest in an ongoing cycle of technological fixes, or do we invest in, again, this recalibration of what it means to live a good life? I think that's the fundamental question. Most of contemporary America says, give me the fix, baby. Come on, right here. I think it's a dead end myself. Creativity is also an interesting question, is what fuels creativity? A lot of people will tell you, markets and the possibility of enriching yourself is what fuels creativity, but I'm not sure I buy that. I think human beings are fundamentally creative animals. I think we create because it's our nature. I do a lot of things that are very creative that I know I'll never make any money off of. I'm sure you all do too. Right? Human creativity does not depend on short-term material rewards. That's my own view. I don't know how to prove that. It's just my observation of the world. Why don't we, let's take maybe a couple more comments or questions, and then I can hang around longer if people want to talk informally, but I'm very aware that it's getting late and people probably had a long day, so. Last round, yes sir.
So you said the world as we know it isn't going to be there for very much longer. Do you have like a time frame? 20 years, 30 years, half century?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. At one point it felt comfortable to talk about these problems as long-term problems that were going to happen in the next century. I think that's increasingly hard to do. I think anybody who tells you here's the time frame for it is, either crazy or trying to sell you something, right? Because these are complex adaptive systems. That's a term you hear in what's sometimes called complexity theory. Complex adaptive systems. We're talking here about social and physical natural systems that are not linear in nature. Right? They don't proceed from A to B to C in a way that you can predict. They're complex systems, and they're adaptive. They're always adapting to changes. Right? And that means it's pretty hard to predict. Right? There are some things you can get a handle on, like rates of erosion of soil I mentioned earlier. Right? You can keep statistics on that and see that, keeping current farming practices in place, we're going to lose about another 23 billion tons of topsoil next year. Right? But I think it's hard to do much beyond that. I would say that the way I plan in my own head used to be in terms of centuries. Now it's in terms of decades. I think that some of these dramatic changes we're talking about are almost certainly going to start being manifested in my own lifetime, assuming I live another 20, 30 years. I think it's undoubtedly true they will happen in your lifetime if you're younger. My kid is 21 years old, and that's how I think. I'm not sure how much of this in the relatively affluent West we're gonna have to deal with in my lifetime, but it's impossible for me to imagine these things the bills coming due in my child's lifetime. And my kid is your generation. But, predictions are, easy to make and usually pretty useless. I will say that if you talk to climate scientists, the official predictions they make, projections they make, in things like the IP, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, those are, most climate scientists will say, fairly conservative estimates. That the climate scientists are afraid of freaking out the public or making claims that they can't sustain. So they're erring on the side of caution, which is kind of paradoxically a very reckless thing to do. We should be looking at worst case scenarios, right, and planning for them. Okay? So I think that whatever stories we tell ourselves so we sleep well at night, and most of the time the story we tell ourselves, well, some bad shit's gonna go down, but it's probably gonna go down long after I'm gone.
Somewhere else,
Yeah, and it's gonna be mostly a problem somewhere else. So you see a typhoon in the Philippines, and you say, well, they're at sea level, of course they're in trouble, You look at what happened in Katrina, or, when a hurricane batters the coast of Florida, and you say, those idiots who live on the shore. There's always a way to sort of lay off the sense of urgency, because we're good at that. We're good at, human beings are good at this denial process. We're all good at it. But I think those are the things we have to collectively start coming to terms with. And the last 5-6 years, almost all of the public speaking I do, at some point comes back to this question. I write, I'll leave my books up here. I write about a lot of things. I write about gender, I write about race, I write about media, I write about economics. And so I get invited to speak about all these things. And I always find some way to bring it back around to this question, because I think we need to talk about it. And I think, although people might say, well, it's a downer, people are thinking about it. It's just that there's nowhere in the culture where you can come together and talk like this and not make people nervous. I mean, I can do it here because Roy invited me, and you're all sitting here, and you're going to listen to me even if you think I'm crazy. But, just go. I always say to my students after we talk about this in class, I say, okay, as an experiment, go to a party on Friday night. Students at UT like to socialize, as you are aware. Some of it involves drinking. And so I say, go to a party and say, just as people are mingling and getting to know each other, I say, especially at the beginning of the year when you don't know anybody yet, say to people, what's your projection for the effects of climate change? And it's the argument about a need for dramatic shifts in economic systems to forestall the worst consequences of that. And people will flock to you, right? At a party, Like, oh, did you hear Bob over in the corner is talking about climate change? Come on. Is that what happens? No, it's like, oh God, I don't want to. But so people say they don't want to talk about this, and they run the other way often. But at some level, I think most people know that what we're talking about tonight is real. Again, I don't expect everybody to agree with every single thing I said. It would be crazy to expect that. Right? They're too complex of questions, and there's too much diversity in the room. So it's not about whether or not you sign on to every little thing I said. It's about whether these questions are relevant in your life or not. And I think a lot of people recognize them to be relevant, but don't have any place to talk about them. And that's why I'm a big believer in creating that space wherever we go. It doesn't lead to predictions about timelines. But it turns out that a lot of the people who have been trying to predict in some way, right, who've been doing studies and computer modeling to try and look at things like resource depletion and global warming, turns out most of those predictions and modeling has been pretty accurate. Not down to the daytime that things are going to happen. Right? But it is complex because you start to predict the end of easily accessible oil, and then they invent a hydrofracking process which allows you to extract a little more oil. But that's a short-term there was just a story in the New York Times today about a new report from the International Energy Agency. The bump in production in the United States from hydrofracking for oil and gas is now clearly being predicted to be a very short-term bump, and we're going to go back to needing the more easily accessible oil of places like the Middle East.
What are they gonna do with the drinking water that was ruined doing that?
Yeah, there's the technological fundamentalist answer was, hey, we got this great new process called hydrofracturing, or fracking as it's called. And it allows us to bust up this shale and get all this oil and gas out. But to do that, we have to pump millions of gallons of sand, water, and chemical, including a lot of chemical waste, into the ground where it's going to sit indefinitely. What does that do to groundwater? Well, the industry says, don't worry, we got it covered.
No, they don't.
My instinct whenever a highly toxic industry says to us, don't worry, we got it covered, is to be very nervous. Because that's the history. That's not paranoia, that's the history. Right? And so all of these things are part of what we have to start talking about. Last point, last question, sure.
Was there ever a time in human history where we didn't aggressively use up our resources? I mean, even in hunter-gatherer times, if the population was big enough, we would have hunted and gathered until there wasn't anything left.
Yeah, no, there is, to make these observations is not to, again, imagine there was some romanticized period in human history when, you know, humans walked in peace with the other animals, right? I mean, you know, we are animals and we do what all animals do. We seek energy-rich carbon. One definition of life is, that's, you know, that all that energy that's in the carbon, we're always going after it, just like bacteria are, and just like every other living thing is. Right? And we've done, in human history, pre-agricultural human history, before we started domesticating plants and animals, human beings exhausted the resources of locales, hunted big game to death. You know, there's a lot of scientific work on, you know, hunting the large woolly mammals to death, right? We got good at hunting, and what did we do? We hunted the game to death. So this is not something that magically drifted into our minds, you know, a couple hundred years ago. The difference is, of course, the consequences are more extreme, because in the past, the consequences of exhausting the capacity of ecosystems to provide what human beings need to live had consequences in a very localized way. And now the consequences are global and inescapable. So I think we can look to the past and look to human practices that were more sustainable, because even though human beings were never perfect, we did a better job at some points in history than others. It's like farming. Farming is a very ecologically destructive enterprise. But there are better and worse ways to farm. You can farm in more sustainable ways than we tend to in this culture, which involves plowing fields, planting row after row of corn, soybeans, wheat, dousing them with petrochemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and eroding topsoil, contaminating the countryside, and making the soil essentially infertile. There are better ways to do farming than that. But there's no really good way to farm. Farming is a very ecologically destructive activity. So there are, you know, there's no point in being romanticized. It's a good place to end, right? The solution isn't to look back and say, well, if only we could get back to the way we were at time X. I don't know where that would be. One last comment.
Yeah, one really quick question. If capitalism is out as an economic system, given democracy's tie to election cycles and short-term solutions, is democracy out as a political system?
You know, that's a perfectly fine, you know. I was starting to get depressed, now I'm really depressed.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We think of democracy, right? The idea that the people are sovereign, not rulers, that we are the source of legitimacy for any particular governing system. We think that somehow that's going to magically produce better results than fascism or monarchy. But we're seeing that, you know, that's not a given. So what does that mean? Well, in the short term, it means trying to the degree we can, disentangle money and politics. I think, you know, everybody except people who are really rich kind of get that. Really rich people say, what's the problem with money and politics? It's working quite well for me, right? the Koch brothers and those folks, they're fine with it because they're running the world. But most of the rest of us realize that when money can influence the democratic process to the degree it can today, that it's not really democracy in any meaningful sense. Okay. So that's a first step. That's a political struggle. Once we get there, there are a lot of other questions about what is the appropriate scales and scope of a political unit. Can we really make a nation of 300 million people work? Right? We didn't evolve in political units of 300 million. We evolved in political units of 100 to 150 people. So it's not even clear that we can make this whole modern enterprise work. There's a lot of questions, and I don't pretend to have the answers, but I know they're important questions. And as every speaker who's too cowardly to go on the record, it's really been the questions I wanted to raise rather than give you answers, which is a cowardly way of saying, I don't have a fucking clue. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. But in this case, I think that's actually a legitimate point, that it's putting the questions on the table in a culture that doesn't want them on the table. And we can all do that in whatever spheres we operate in. So with that, a couple of things and then I'll shut up. I have sign-up sheets up here. One is for an email list that is run by a group I'm part of called the Third Coast Activist Resource Center. If you sign up for that list, once a week, every Monday morning, you'll get an email that will tell you about events going on that reflect the interests I've been telling you about. Concerns about militarism, about economics, about ecology. If you were on that list, you would have seen an announcement of this event tonight, for instance. Okay. But it's only one email a week. You won't get inundated with spam. The other one is called the Robert Jensen Updates email list, and that's an automated list that every time I write a new article, I just post it and it gets sent out. That's one every couple of weeks at the most. I also brought copies of books I've done if you want to see what I've been working on. Other than that, I should thank Roy, who, for reasons I cannot really understand, continues to invite me back semester after semester. Most people, once they've heard me speak once, they're, well, thank you very much. God, we're never inviting that asshole back. Roy just keeps it coming, so I keep coming back. And in part, I was actually kind of serious about what I said. I like my students at UT, and there's a lot of great students there. But I've always found that ACSD students, there's a kind of scrappiness here that I really like. That was a compliment. Scrappy. Intellectual. No, shut up and listen. I'm trying to say something nice, you're all laughing. A kind of intellectual scrappiness, right? At UT, and this is an interesting reflection, but the elite universities are often the places where there's the least amount of critical thinking going on. Go to Yale and Harvard, right? What you get is a lot of little dweebs who want to be rich and are practicing on how to be rich. Not thinking, really, but being socialized into the system, right? When you get out of those elite institutions, often what you find, and I mean this as truly as a compliment, a kind of intellectual scrappiness, an unwillingness to just accept what you're told. Right? And that's part of the reason I like ACC, and I always like coming back. I'm always grateful when Roy invites me. So thank you for hanging out for a long, long time. Appreciate it.